Hey there, welcome to the CircuitMess Nibble build video. In this build guide, you'll discover how to assemble the Nibble game console. You'll also learn how to use a couple of tools along the way. Are you ready? Age group. As it says on the box, you should be at least 9 years old to assemble this console. With that in mind, parts of the assembly like soldering and tightening bolts should be approached carefully. Ask an adult to help out if you've never soldered before. What you'll learn. Nibble's main goal is to educate and motivate you to learn something new, or brush up on the skills you already have. It also serves as an entry point into electronics, making it the perfect project for starting your big engineering career. In the process of assembly, you'll learn how to solder, how game consoles work and what the basic electronic components are, how to program a microcontroller in C/C++ and in circuit blocks, the basics of game graphics, how to code a microcomputer, and how to make your own games. What's in the box? So you've got your CircuitMess Nibble in front of you. Cool! The first thing we need to do is go over all the components and make sure you have all of them laid out on your table and ready for assembly. As you can see, you should have 6 clear protective acrylic casings, 1 Nibble mainboard, this is the PCB, a soldering iron stand, a roll of solder, a soldering iron, the battery holder, the micro USB cable, a Phillips screwdriver, the display breakout board or LCD, a cleaning sponge, a component bag which contains buttons, bolts and spacers, and 3 AAA batteries. Your Nibble kit was hand-packed with love in Croatia by us, the CircuitMess team, and we always double-check the parts, but mistakes can happen. In case something is missing, please contact us at contact@circuitmess.com and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Soldering Basics. Have you ever soldered before? Yes? You'll probably know what you're doing there, and you can just skim through this soldering section. If this is your first time, however, I would highly recommend checking out the description for a list of how-to solder guides. Now that you're familiar with soldering, let's go over the 6 rules of soldering. Number 1. Never inhale the dust and the fumes that can be produced by the soldering iron. These can be hazardous, so please don't inhale them. Number 2. Never touch the tip of the soldering iron. Even if the soldering iron is turned off or completely disconnected from the power source, there is still a possibility that it's very hot and therefore can cause very uncomfortable pain if touched. Number 3. Clean the soldering iron. The sponge is your best friend while soldering. Make sure to use it often to clean your soldering iron if you wish to have an easy and simple soldering experience. Number 4. Check your solder joints twice at least. Most of the malfunctions in the world of electronics are due to bad solder joints, so regardless if this is your first or 100th soldering project, always make sure to inspect your joints multiple times before proceeding to the next step. Number 5. Know how much solder is needed. Make sure to put just enough solder, not too much, and not too little, since both can cause the device to malfunction. Number 6. Don't leave any residue solder on the board. The solder should only be on the parts of the console where the pins connect to the board, and everything else should be clean. Little pieces of solder all over the board are a big no-no. How to use your soldering iron. Before we get started soldering, we need to make sure we know how to use the tools correctly. Our main tool is our new snazzy soldering iron, so let's learn how to use it. Step 1. Set up your soldering iron so it stands on the stand as shown. After you do that, grab a power outlet or extension lead and plug it in to let it heat up. Step 2. Set the temperature on the soldering iron to 250 degrees by turning the regulator. There is a small black arrow next to the regulator wheel, so make sure that it points to the right temperature. Your soldering iron is now ready to use, but give it a minute or 2 so it can heat up. The safest way to do that is to leave it on the stand while you wait for it to be ready to use. Step 3. Once you're done with soldering, don't worry, we'll let you know when that time comes. You'll unplug the iron from the power outlet and then turn it off. Please use the soldering iron stand each time you are not using it so you don't burn the surface or the circuit board. Make sure to not touch the soldering iron tip for at least 5 minutes after you have turned it off. So now we know how to use the tools correctly and safely. What are we waiting for? Let's just jump right in. Chapter 1. soldering the components. Introduction. The first part of the assembly process will be soldering. After that, we will be putting the soldering iron aside, testing the console and building up the casing. After that comes the easiest part, playing games and enjoying the console. Of course, the learning is never over. Once you've got your console, you can create and code your own games, share them with your friends, and break all of the high scores to prove you're the best of all Nibble gamers. But for now, that will have to wait. So what are we waiting for? Let's get started. Buttons beside the screen are very important if you want to move, shoot, dodge, jump, and pause in games. The Nibble has 7 buttons that we need to solder on, and one already attached to your console, called the reset button, on top of the console. The first thing we need to do is place. Take one of the mechanical button parts and put it through the holes. There are a total of 7 button placement locations, each with 4 little holes, that mark the following buttons: menu, up, left, down, right, A, and B. Make sure to place the buttons on the correct side. You should be able to see the little button text and white outlines when placing the buttons. The solder joint is located on the back of the console, the side with the white patterns on it. The next step is soldering. Before we start soldering, make sure the button is flat by clicking it a couple times. Once we know it is flat, turn the PCB around and get ready to solder the joint in. Firstly, carefully place the soldering iron on one of the pins so that it's touching both the pin and the plated area around the hole that the pin is going through. Leave it like that for about 5 to 10 seconds to allow it to heat up the pin and plate, and then apply the tip of the solder to it. The solder should melt with ease and spread evenly around the joint. Make sure to create a volcano-like shape so that the base of the joint is filled with the solder, but the top is getting thinner and thinner. Great! You've just created your first soldering joint on your Nibble. Repeat the process for the other 3 pins and make sure that the button is still sitting flat and fully pushed from the other side, or that it hasn't moved sideways in any directions. When all 4 joints are fully soldered and the button isn't moving and it can still be clicked, the first component is successfully soldered. Congratulations, 1 down and many more to go. The same process must be applied to all of the buttons. Take your time, be patient, and remember, always double check your solder joints. After all 7 buttons are soldered, a total of 28 connections must have been made. Check if all the buttons can be clicked. If all is well, move on to the next step. If you're unsure about some solder joints, it's always better to fix them rather than leaving them at a might work later on. You should always make sure everything is as good as it can be. Part 2. Soldering on the switch. Unfortunately, the console cannot stay powered on all the time, and sometimes you have to power it off. This is where the switch comes in. You can easily switch the console on and off with one simple push. Pretty cool, right? Let's solder it in. The first thing we need to do is place the component. The process of soldering this component in is exactly the same as the previous ones. Take the switch, put the pins through the holes so that the switch lies on the front, yellow part of the main board, and the pins stick out of the back, the mostly white side. Try to wiggle the switch when pushing it inside, since it may require a bit of force to fit in properly. Make sure before we solder the switch in place that the switch is as close to the board as possible. Now we've got to solder the component. Now that the switch is in the right place, turn your console around, take your soldering iron from the stand, clean it using the handy sponge, and begin soldering the pins in place. To do this, hold the tip of the iron between the pin and pad, and, after about 3 to 4 seconds, apply solder to the pin. These pins are quite close together, so make sure you don't accidentally bridge the pins like this. What's bridging, you ask? Bridging is most common when you are soldering 2 pins that are very close together, like right now. Bridging is where you accidentally create a connection between 2 pins that should be connected, which can cause a lot of problems inside a circuit and can ultimately lead to a short circuit that will damage your components. Now that we know what the problem is, let's look at how we can fix it. Breaking off the bridge joint is easy. Just place the heated soldering iron in the middle, take the excessive solder off, and clean the soldering iron on the sponge. Repeat the process several times if needed. Heat and clean until the bridge is removed. Clean the soldering iron so you don't have any residue solder on it. Now that we have fixed the problem, let's check if the switch is soldered in strong enough. Go ahead and try the switch a few times to make sure it clicks on and off, and if everything is alright, we can continue with the build. Part 3. The screen. Now onto the big one, the display. This thing makes everything that is happening inside the console actually come to life. All of the pixels, colors, characters, letters and numbers are shown on this beauty. Since this is pretty much the most important part of the console, together with the processor, you should treat it with care. Try not to touch the backside of the screen and especially avoid touching the screen with your soldering iron, hot or cold. Except for the pins, we need to solder those. You'll also notice a little protective layer on top of it, which you can take off by pulling the little green part. But don't do that just yet. This ensures the screen stays protected all the way through the soldering and assembly part. So, the first thing we need to do is place the screen. Inserting the screen is pretty much the same as the other components. Just make sure to push the pins all the way through so that the screen fits firmly in place. Soldering the first pin. Before starting the soldering process, make sure to place some soft material under the screen so that it doesn't get damaged or scratched while facing down on the table. Since the screen should be vertically soldered to the board, let's handle this part with care. There's a couple of steps we need to do to ensure it's vertical and parallel. Firstly, solder the first pin in the row, then check if the screen sits flat on the board and is vertically soldered to the board. If needed, resolder the first pin in the row to allow you to move the screen to make it parallel to the PCB. Once perpendicular to the board, resume with soldering the rest of the pins. It's best to solder the pin opposite to secure the pin in place, like so. After you finish soldering, check all the joints and make sure the screen is sitting flat and firm on the main board. Any sideways movement is not good and should be checked and fixed. Do not take off the protective plastic just yet. We know it's super satisfying to peel it off, but leave it for later. Part 4. Soldering the battery holder. This part is probably the easiest one to solder. While it does take up a large part of the console, it only has 2 pins. Unlike all of the other parts, this one goes onto the back of the console, the mostly white side. The pins should go through the hole so that they're visible from the front side, like so. Then we need to solder the pins in place, like before. Pick up the soldering iron and solder the 2 pins. It's as easy as it gets. And that's all the soldering we need to do. But don't unplug the iron just yet. We must first check that everything is working properly before we do that. Chapter 2. First check. Why we need to test. Everything needed for the console to function is done. Great. The first thing to do next is to check that everything works. Only after doing that should we go on with assembling the casings. Why do we need to test? Well, it would be a lot of work to disassemble the casing after we found out that something is wrong. That's why it's important to do this simple check. In the box you receive 3 batteries. You'll need to place these batteries inside the battery holder that you've just soldered. Plugging in the 3 batteries. The batteries are marked with 2 little symbols, plus and minus, which represent the polarity of the battery. The plus part has a little metal bulge at the end of it, while the minus part has a little dent. This is really important since when inserting the batteries, you'll have to be super careful about which side goes where. Take a battery and place it on the outer 2 slots so that the minus symbol is pushed up against the little spring. When inserting it, make sure to first insert the minus part so that you push the spring with the battery, and then lightly insert the other side inside the holder. You need to use a little bit of strength in this process. If you're unable to do so, ask someone older or stronger for assistance. It's all about teamwork. Now that we have 2 out of the 3 batteries fitted, we can go ahead and place the middle battery. This one is a little bit different as the battery is placed in the other way around. Make sure that you don't do any soldering while the batteries are inside. Fitting the fuse. Before turning your nibble on, you have to insert the fuse that will keep all of the components untouched if something goes wrong inside the circuit. There are a total of 3 fuses and they can be replaced if needed as well. Take one of the fuses from the package and insert it into the little holder next to the buzzer. It doesn't matter which way you put the fuse, as long as the little black text on it is facing upwards. It might be a bit tricky at first, but don't be afraid to push it inside. As long as it's facing upwards, your fuse should be just fine. Turn the switch on. Now that the batteries and the fuse are both properly inserted, take the console in your hands and place the switch in the on position. If the screen remains black, that could mean one of the components is not properly soldered. Check for any bad solder joints, solder bridges, unsoldered pins, and residue solder somewhere on the board. Always remove the batteries and set the switch to the off position before starting any soldering. Refitting the fuse. If you found a mistake in soldering, it is likely that you've created a short circuit. In order not to fry any of the components, we've added an additional fuse that should stop the circuit from creating any permanent damage to the components. This gives you a chance to check over all the solder joints and solder them in. Once you are sure that all the solder joints have been fixed, it's necessary to replace the fuse so that it can provide the same short circuit protection once more. Carefully remove the fuse with a toothpick or some similar tool and replace it with another one. There are a total of 3 fuses in the package. Now, reinsert the batteries, turn the switch back on and everything should work. If it looks like this and shows the menu screen, great job. That brings us to the end of the soldering portion. The next stop, button caps. However, you should only move on if everything is working a-okay. Don't forget, turn off your soldering iron. You can finally unplug the soldering iron from the power outlet. Remember to not touch the tip of the soldering iron and leave it to cool down for at least 5 minutes. Chapter 3, button caps. Even though the console can work as is, it can look and feel much better. The buttons themselves are rather small and are not the most comfortable thing to hold. That's why we've included 8 button caps. You really need 7, but 1 is for good luck. To cover those little buttons and make them more clickable, we use the button caps. Let's put them on our console. Attaching the caps onto your buttons is quite simple. Simply take the cap, place it onto the button, and click it in hard as if you were pressing the button. It should click on and remain in place after you release it, and the button can still be clicked like so. Great! Now let's focus on the casing. Chapter 4, casing up. Now comes the most fun part of assembling Nibble, putting these neat, cool, transparent casings on it. You might be wondering, why does it have a total of 6 plastic parts? Well, each and every one of them is there to keep your console not only safe from falling, but also to make the console more comfortable to hold. It also makes sense in a bit. Remove the protective layer, plus peel off the screen.
Nice.
Right now the casings look a bit bluish. This is because they have a little protective cover that keeps them safe from scratches until they are ready to be used. So, before we start assembling the casing, we need to go ahead and take this layer off. To do this, use your nail to lift up the protective cover on one of the corners. Once we have lifted it up, we can grip the cover and peel it off the casing. Satisfying? Oh yeah. Make sure to do this for the other side too, on all of the panels. Time lapse? Yep. Sandwiching the casings together. For this part of the assembly, you're going to use the 3 different types of bolts and 2 different types of spacers: small, medium, and big. Make sure that you always use the correct size bolt. This is really important so that the whole casing can fit together nicely. It's also super important to separate each casing as they are stacked on top of one another. Remember the sandwich design? You have to make sure to stack them in the correct order. Here you can see all of the casings laid out, from top to bottom. The first case we need is the back case. Here you can see that we take the last 2 panels and layer them onto the back of the PCB. We then take the first layer of the front casing and place it at the front while holding the ones in the back. Then, while holding all of this together, we take the 4mm golden spacer, the smaller one, and place it through one of the holes on the upper side of the board, close to the edge. We then take the medium bolt, 8mm in length, and screw it in from the back side. Tighten it as much as you can with your fingers and then switch over to the screwdriver to make sure it's secured in place. We then do the same thing on the other side, like so. Now the back panels are in place, we need to fit the front panels. To do this, grab the layer with big empty rectangular holes on both sides and put it on the board. The part with little circular holes for the buttons and the buzzer is the last one that goes on top, like so. Now we need to secure them in place. Grab two smaller 6mm bolts and screw them into the two golden spaces that you have already put in place, like so. Make sure to tighten them with a screwdriver. Now the casings won't really go anywhere. However, let's screw in the two bottom bolts just to be sure. Place the two larger screws, which are 16mm in length, in the bottom two holes and screw them into the larger spacers, which are 14mm in length. Take the spacer and place it on top of the bolt from the back, the mostly white side of the board. Tighten the bolt and the spacer using the screwdriver. Repeat the same process for the other hole. If the batteries are already inside the battery holder, which they should be from the chapter First Check, then you just have one final step left. If you've taken them out in the meantime, or just never did the check, then now is the time to place the batteries back in the holder. Now the final touch. Take the last piece of the transparent casing, the small rectangle, and place it on top of the batteries so that the holes are aligned with the golden spaces. Then take the two smaller 6mm bolts and screw them into the spaces so that the battery plastic cover is tightened. You did it! Voila! You have just completed the assembly of your own brand new gaming console, the Nibble. Remember to peel off the protective cover if you haven't already and turn it on like so. Remember to turn off your soldering iron. Unplug it from the power source, place it on the soldering iron stand and let it cool off for at least 5 minutes before you put it away in your tools box. So what's next? Firstly, you should be proud of yourself. It's game time. Before we get gaming though, there are a couple of good to know things. There are a couple of additional things you need to keep an eye on while using the console. Firstly, what does this cable do? The micro USB to USB cable is used to connect the console to your computer and to download new software updates, as well as to upload your own games you've created using Circuit Blocks. Wait, what? What is Circuit Blocks? Circuit Blocks is a graphical programming interface that helps newbies get into embedded programming. It's based on Microsoft's MakeCode and PXT Blockly, Google Blockly fork, and it presents the user with a slick, scratch-like interface in which they connect logic blocks to generate code for their Makerphone and Nibble, and soon other CircuitMess devices. You can find more about Circuit Blocks by following the link in the description. All you need to do to get connected is to plug your console into the computer so it gets recognized. It's kinda like magic. What's this button do? This is the small reset button on top of the console. This is used to quickly reset the console. Use this button whenever the console gets stuck or if it's loading for too long. However, do not touch this button while playing the game since it will erase your game progress. What if my batteries run out of juice? If your batteries ever run out of juice, make sure to replace them with AAA batteries. It's best to use the batteries from the same pack since they're all going to last the same amount of time. You did it! Look at you go, you've created your very own game console. I don't know about you, but I'm gonna play mine. I might even code my own game. That's enough from me. Have fun playing your console, and remember to check out CircuitMess.com for even more resources. This has been Jack. Have a blast.